Thank you everybody for joining us today. Really excited to be presenting this expert panel here today where we're going to be discussing really largely the role of a specific learning theory, and that is social learning and its role inside the modern workplace. It's going to be not such a high level conversation. We're not going to be talking about theory too much. We're going to touch on it a little bit for those who are kind of new to the topic, but largely speaking, we are going to be talking about programs, measurement, advice, practical stuff that you can leave today with this knowledge and have a good grasp about how you can actually implement social learning within your current company's L&D strategy. So just to give you a quick little overview of how we're going to cover today and really what's going to be happening over the next hour, we're going to do a brief little introduction, cover who the panelists are. We got Rory and also Nathan as well here. I'll provide a brief little introduction. After that, we're going to get into the main event, which is the panelist questions. So we've got a series of questions that we're going to be asking both Rory and Nathan, get their insights and ideas on social learning programs as well. After that, we're going to save about 10 minutes if we've got time for a little bit of audience Q&A. So if you do have questions and you're looking for an answer to them, please make sure to put them in the Q&A feature. It is right beside the chat feature. This just helps us track questions, make sure that we can actually see them and we don't miss them. So it's greatly appreciated if you can put your questions in there. Before we get on, just a quick little introduction to Together for those who are kind of interacting with us for the first time. So Together, we are a mentorship platform. We help organizations around the world and professional associations run their mentorship programs, providing them the tools with everything from registering and inviting participants, matching them together, developing them with session content as well, and most importantly, the reporting on the impact of mentorship in your organization. So we really help admins run these programs, manage them from start to finish. We're honored to be trusted by organizations like Heineken, Kellogg's, Airbnb, Discovery Channel, and so many more. We have been named a leader in the mentorship software space, largely due to our ability to create incredible user experiences for both admins and end users. My name is Brent. I'm going to be the host today, and if I do my job, I will be speaking very little and letting our experts, Rory and Nathan, take the stage as much as possible. So moving on, I'd like to introduce some of our panelists that we have here today. So the first of which is Rory Sachs. He's been a learning strategist for over 15 years, working across several different industries, often being the first hire at a lot of companies. Some names that you might recognize are Investopedia. So he's helped start L&D programs from scratch and really create high-performing organizations. His most recent role was at Komodo Health, where he was a director of learning and talent management. He's also the host of a L&D podcast called Is Training the Answer, where, like today, he interviews L&D experts, practitioners, and thought leaders and teases out their insights on learning and development best practices. Our second panelist today is Nathan Goldstein. So Nathan is the co-founder of Together. He founded Together alongside Matt Reeves, our CEO, in 2018 with the goal of fixing learning at work. Since founding Together, Nathan has led the product development, helping L&D teams create successful mentorship programs that really make career-changing opportunities and career-changing connections for thousands of employees at companies around the world. Prior to founding Together, Nathan was a consultant at Boston Consulting Group, where he was exposed to several employee engagement projects and worked with some of the leading companies in the world. So Rory, Nathan, thank you so much for being here. Before we hop into questions, is there anything you'd like to say to the audience?
Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
Thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, my perspective on social learning programs is from that product development perspective. I've been building software to help with learning programs for many years now. And so if there's something on the technology side that you have something in the Q&A for after, I'm happy to do my best to answer it.
Amazing. Awesome. So without further ado, I think we'll get into what everybody's been waiting for, questions. So I want to start things off kind of little high for those people who are interacting with the idea of social learning theory for the first time, just to give everybody a brief introduction to the topic, get everybody on the same page. So I'd like to pose the first question. Rory, feel free to kick this one off. What exactly is social learning and what value can it bring to an organization?
Yeah, so social learning, put simply, is really just people kind of finding their place within their environment, using social cues, talking with people, visually seeing and hearing things. And when we kind of translate that into the workplace, it's all of kind of what happens in an office, on a Zoom meeting, understanding the environment, how to react within the environment, and to take that information in, spit it back out, and grow.
Nice. Nathan, any builds on that? Anything that you think is important?
Yeah, and so I think I take a lens very much of the world of tools for learning in organizations. And so I have a slightly different definition that I use for myself. My definition is simple. Social learning is the opposite of independent learning. And so independent learning to me involves one person learning on their own by studying content or practicing. And importantly, even if that content is written by a colleague, it's that unidirectional consumption of that content without the ability to ask questions and discuss further that makes something independent learning in my mind. And so reading documentation is integral to independent learning. However, if you have a comment section or you can follow up and do a call to ask questions and get answers, that would be social learning based on my definition, because now that becomes bi-directional. And so there's more than kind of one direction there. It could be workshops and training. It could be group circles. So that's all social learning to me versus independent learning.
Yeah. So the introduction of social cues, the ability of people to communicate with others, those who have more knowledge than them as well, too, to really create, again, a bit of a contextual environment for learning, where you are getting that information from people who are more senior from you, who have more knowledge, or can test your thinking in that way as well, too. Is that right? Nice. Okay. So moving on from kind of this introduction to just people connecting with people and learning in a non-unidirectional way, for example, getting that down to a little bit more of an applied point of view as well, too. So we really want to understand, like, how can this theory actually be implemented within an organization? How can it contribute and complement what is already there with courses, with training programs? So in this, I want to ask, where should L&D leaders start when thinking about creating a social learning strategy, or how to integrate social learning into their existing learning and development strategy? Again, Roy, let you take this one off first.
Sure. So it should be part of any learning and development strategy at its base. And on top of that, every learning and development strategy should evolve, but really be foundational around this concept of creating a culture of learning within the organization. When you develop and start to create that culture, that learning is important, that it could be self-directed. You want to grow, you go out, you seek the learning opportunities yourself. And then because you're creating this culture, you share that information. You can put it into LMS, you can put it onto Confluence. It should just kind of be ingrained, expanding the scope of your current strategy to involve social learning. And in reality, when you think about it, it also helps to alleviate a lot of the lift off of learning development, creating the products or the training that you're pushing out to the org. By integrating this social learning concept, you can then start to focus on priority training. So a great thing that we did at Komodo, we took the concept of social learning and kind of expanded it as much as we possibly could, whether it was utilizing our internal LMS, which we call Edison, the forums there, but also allowing people to create their own courses directly within our LMS. Again, capturing that institutional knowledge within the organization, giving people the ownership over sharing their level of knowledge, and ultimately alleviating a tremendous lift off of learning development which then allowed us to prioritize higher level training initiatives rather than kind of focusing on lower hanging fruit.
So, quick follow-up question to that is,
Yeah.
with in this idea of kind of like learner-driven or demand-driven learning, where the employee actually seeks out their own learning opportunities. Could you touch a little bit more on how that actually changes the roles and responsibilities of an L&D team and an L&D practitioner, for example?
Yeah. So it really works if the organization has built that foundational culture that learning is important. And then what happens is people start to seek their own growth opportunities. They're kind of given the keys themselves. So traditionally, learning development, people partners, we'll just call it the greater people team, creates these kind of very linear career paths. You're here, you want to get here. These are the things you kind of have to do. It's very prescriptive. But if we flip that, take into concept this social learning, let people be self-directed, well, now they're kind of moving the needle themselves. They're identifying their own skills gaps. They're seeking out training that is relevant to them in the role that they do, rather than depending on their manager or their manager's manager or their manager's manager's manager to say, these are the skills that are needed in this role, when they just might not know. And it's an important data point for us to collect as well. So when we look at our learning management system, we can see how many people self-enroll in training, whether it's in e-learning, whether it's going to a conference or reading a book or whatever it is. And we evaluate that. And our goal is to move that needle the most. The more engagement we get, so the more self-enrollment we get, the better we see our culture of learning getting, and thus kind of this whole social learning concept kind of explode, because it's now the organization that's training and teaching each other, rather than it being just very prescriptive from learning and development and compliance.
Nathan, any thoughts to add before asking any other follow-up questions on that?
Yeah, I think for me, the key thing here, to continue with my prior point, is to assess the current state of how much of your employees' learning is happening independently versus socially. Are you in the kind of culture where people are encouraged to watch courses in an LMS by themselves, or read documentation by themselves, or take an online course in the evenings? Or is your company in the kind of culture that has a lot of live interaction, one-on-ones, group sessions, workshop opportunities for people to exchange knowledge? Do you have Slack channels that are focused on exchanging ideas? Do you have town halls where people can ask questions? Do employees create content for others to consume or not? Like, is someone creating a podcast internally? And so to me, a lot of the times with learning and development, the first thing that you do is you get an LMS and you load courses in there, and then you kind of encourage people to take them, which I consider independent learning. And a lot of the tools out there today are geared towards independent learning. So don't be surprised if the answer is, once you do that assessment, you are too skewed towards independent learning. It's traditionally been harder to do the social learning type interactions because they require workshops or live events or somebody to organize it. And so you make that assessment first. Probably later on in the webinar, I'll talk about different kinds of social learning formats that you can use. But I think if that's the case, then you've skewed a little bit more towards independent learning than social learning, and maybe you want to have more of a mix. So that'd be where I would start.
For sure. Touching on that point of, again, just the unidirectional learning, and I want to pose this question to Roy to see if based on your experience, what your thoughts on this are. But what would you say? There's obviously a time and a place for everything. There's a time and a place when people just need to learn skills and they need to sit down and they need to read the book, the documentation, or take the course. what would you say is the right context for social learning versus the right context for that more, again, unidirectional sit down, learn, read, regurgitate, repeat?
That's a good question. I think what's happening is we're trying to define social learning too narrowly. Social learning happens all the time, like by definition, whether you know it's happening or it's not. And so by saying, well, we're going to implement social learning strategies, you're starting to define something that really is not definable, because it is understanding your environment. So a great example is this. This is just as much social learning as if you have a one-on-one meeting with your manager that is not about learning at all, right? Because what you're going to take away from that is, how does my manager engage with me? What do I like? What do I not like? What do I want to roll into my methodology of being a manager? What do I not want to roll into that? And so when you think of learning and social learning from an organizational standpoint, everything is learning. Everything. Somebody reads a book, somebody attends a live session, somebody goes to a board meeting. That is all learning. It's all social learning. It's just trying to find more and more ways to distribute the right information that at the end of the day is going to help the business meet its goals. That's what we're doing here, right? Yeah. Our goal on learning and development, on sales, is to meet the goals of the business. And however it is that our organization is going to do that through learning opportunities, that's where learning and development needs to position themselves.
Yeah. And I think we're touching on a few points that I think lend well to the next question. This ubiquity of social learning and what it is. It's everywhere it happens, whether it's a program that you intentionally design and implement or not. And the other point too is that it's largely about the culture. Like, as both of you mentioned, it's the culture of how do you interact with people. Our salespeople, teaching other people, and how are they doing that? So I want to kind of use this as a way to get into the next question. And again, keeping a broad and open definition of programs, because I think the topic of social learning requires that, is to discuss a little bit about what are the things that an L&D team can do to leverage social learning and maybe build some structure around this pervasive kind of thing that's happening, which is social learning. It's happening, like you said, whether you want it to or not, whether it's intentional by L&D or not, it's happening. So yeah, I want to kick this off. What sort of programs would you consider core to social learning, that if you do want to leverage this theory, this mode of learning, what kind of programs would or activities really would an L&D team kind of like pursue? And Nathan, do you want to take this one off too?
Sure, yeah, I can start. And I guess my answer for this is based on just working with and building software for learning and development teams among our customer base, and seeing both how our software helps them, but also what other things they are doing. To me, the three primary formats that I've seen really effectively work for social learning is one-on-one mentorship programs, where you're matching people across the organization one-on-one to learn based on skills and goals. Two is a more of a group format. You can call it a lunch and learn or a workshop. Lunch and learn kind of tends to have the connotation that an employee is coming in and bringing the content, versus a workshop might be, maybe either an employee or like the L&D team themselves or an external consultant. The point is you have a one-off group session, call it a lunch and learn or a workshop. And then the third format that works really well is recurring group circles. So that's also a group event, but where you've actually put together a cohort or a circle of people that is consistent across, say, 6 to 12 weeks. What we've seen that really work well for is maybe putting together a bunch of new managers in a peer group, or for example, for women at doing lean in circles. So within those three main formats, I'd say then you have audiences. What are the common kind of audiences that you want to run this for? And there's a bunch that I have in mind that I've seen work really well. One is, of course, a specific department. Let's say you want to run one-on-one mentorship within sales, so that your, say, sales development reps are being mentored by your account executives. Another is employees that are onboarding or interns new to the company. That's a really good audience to do these formats for. New managers, as I mentioned earlier, high potential talent, DEI group like or an ERG like Women At. And what we've even seen kind of post-pandemic is something like parents, for example, because whether you like it or not, there are a set of skills that you kind of need to learn to be someone who's a parent that's succeeding in the workplace and managing both of those responsibilities at the same time. So we've seen those work really well. I think some other kind of unique ones, depending on the nature of your company, could also be a hackathon. So a hackathon is a really great way for engineers to get together and some of the adjacent roles around that to kind of interact together, learn from each other while producing some kind of product. And if you're not in an engineering organization, there are things like innovation tournaments or other formats that are similar to that. Internally at Together Software, every single yearly retreat that we do, we have a case competition that's similar to a hackathon where we consider that a social learning event. So those are just some of the formats that I've seen.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on a very good point. I think one of the things we've learned here at Together by interfacing with the topic of mentorship so often is that, and I think everyone in the audience would also know this to be.
You're on mute. Oh, there you go.
Am I on mute?
Sorry,
no, we're good.
You had cut out for a second for me. Maybe it was just me. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no worries. Okay. No, what I was saying was that, as professionals, mentorship is one of these things that, even as an individual professional, we've sought out ourselves. And I think that's a great understanding for, making the case that it does happen. Again, whether L&D wants it to happen or not, there's going to be a set of employees who are seeking mentorship out. I think what we've found by working with a lot of clients is that by making it an formal or, an intentional program where there is, invites and there is targeted outreach towards certain audiences, that really expands the benefit, expands the accessibility of the program, and the benefit of the social learning means as well to that one-to-one or one-to-many connection. I'm sure we could talk about mentorship all day, but I want to make sure that Rory gets some time on this because I know he's got a lot of valuable experience creating social learning programs that also go a lot more beyond mentorship. So Rory, would love to hear your take on, oops, looks like we switched slides here while doing the audio. Would love to hear your take on what kind of programs are effective and core to social learning.
Yeah, so when developing we don't look at it, or I try not to look at it as we're going to develop social learning programs, right? We're looking to create programs that work, that distribute the knowledge that we're looking to distribute effectively, and then that we can track outcomes for. I think, and again, social learning conceptually is really great. It's really interesting. But when we start to say, well, this is social learning and this isn't social learning, is when we start to kind of run into division of things that really aren't necessary. And then we start to kind of really think about, well, what is social learning versus collaborative learning? Right. So if I'm looking at our learning management system at Komodo, we use a product called 360 Learning, which we really like, but their big thing is collaborative learning. Well, what's the difference? And as soon as so therefore, like once we start saying, well, this is social, this isn't, then we're not looking holistically at the organization. We're not looking at the culture that we're trying to build when it comes to learning and development. Again, our goal is to meet the needs of the business, what works, what doesn't. In some organizations, some things work. So at Komodo, podcasts work. They're great. But at other organizations that I've worked at, they didn't. And so it's just kind of, it's not worth trying to fit the foot into the glass slipper at that company in that organization. If mentorship works, then great. But just because you have a mentorship program and people have mentorship meetings, is it working? What are the data points that we're looking at to determine that that does work? Because could that time be spent elsewhere? But again, like to me, when it comes to developing social learning platforms or programs, it's all about leadership and executive buy-in. It's all about creating that culture of learning, because you want people to seek it out, right? You want them to share. You want them to be at the lunch and learn, right? Like you don't want to reach out to somebody and say like, hey, do you want to be on this lunch and learn panel? And their response is, no, I got 10 other meetings that are a priority. But if learning and the culture of learning is important, then people are going to prioritize that. They're going to feel that they bring value to the company and to the organization, and they'll be on that panel. And then from there, you can continue to kind of grow those social aspects.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you touch on an important point of nuance as well, too. Organizations, even those who are competing against each other, look very different from one another, even between industries. So yeah, making sure that your L&D program and the programs that you are launching, and if you do want to think about how can we leverage a more social or whatever semantic word, collaborative way, it's important to think about what is going to fit with the target audience. And I think that's true for any kind of program or anything you're building. It's got to fit the needs of the people, and it's got to be logically connected to the outcomes. Which
absolutely,
I think one thing to add to that is on kind of social learning versus independent learning. I think if you're to ask yourself, okay, I'm going to look back in the past and think about when I did a program to help my high potential talent with their leadership skills, or when I did a program to address a topic like gender bias at work, is that something where the medium of that was reading or watching a video, or was the medium of that something that was a live session, like a workshop or something like that? And to me, those kinds of things tend to be answered within and addressed within live workshops. And so kind of expanding further on those formats of social learning versus independent learning, I just think that there's a fundamental difference between what skills you can learn depending on the medium. I don't think that the answers to things like how do I become a better manager, or how do I deal with gender bias at work, or how do we build scalable solutions at our company, I don't think those things are easily addressed in an independent learning setting where you're simply kind of reading or watching a video. I think those are the things where there's bidirectional discussion and in a live setting. That's not to knock independent learning. I think there are plenty of things where consuming that content independently is really important for certain types of skills. But kind of my definition is a different set of skills that you can learn in these types of mediums with social learning.
Those are interesting points. I mean, I think, I'd agree to disagree. Again, being in the industry for some time, just like you, and having developed these programs, I think by doing so, by again, like drawing that line of directional and bidirectional, e-learning can be just as bidirectional as attending a live session. I think what happens so frequently is learning development departments aren't creative enough. They're not utilizing the technology appropriately to create those environments that people can learn bidirectionally, asynchronously, versus also synchronously. Right? I can create an e-learning that has a social learning component where somebody watches a video, reads an article, then has to record themselves, let's say, pitching their sales pitch or whatever, and then gets feedback from their manager or the instructor on the live training session, or a colleague. It could be a video response. It could be a written response. That's now asynchronous e-learning that is bi-directional. I've done something, I'm getting that feedback, and then I now have to record myself again, or I'm on a call live and I'm introducing what I learned, the feedback that I got, I think, again, like drawing the line and saying directional, bidirectional, e-learning versus in-person removes what we're trying to get at, which is the shared knowledge of the organization to move the business goals going forward, right? Like if you have the right systems and the right tools, social learning can be anywhere, and it can in theory be anything, and it should be anything. We shouldn't, as learning development professionals, be limiting ourselves to this is how this learning happens and this is how we do this learning. But
yeah, I think a common thread here is what I'm seeing is social learning is something that can be added to, again, a more traditional learning, reading a book and whatnot, is something that can be added on to it. But I think what's important is that the core of it, and for those in the audience, how to think about, okay, well, how can I leverage this idea about how people learn, is that it's the means and the medium through which you employ it is really just adding that additional organizational context, which help you, go from learning a fact or learning a new skill to learning a new skill that is relevant and can help your company today in the way that it needs to be helped. That's what I really see is the commonality between I think both of your answers.
yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. Cool. So I think this kind of sets us up for a little bit of touching on this point. Rory, I know you mentioned measurement, and I know ultimately you've had this view that the role of learning and development is really something that you should be measuring yourself on whether or not the business is doing well. So would love to hear you talk about how the effectiveness of social learning, or even just learning strategies in general, what kind of strategies or tactics to be measured?
Yeah. We're always looking to measure the success of our learning and our training against the goals of the business, right? I think, yeah, there are some times where you have to look at attendance and course completion, and those are great measurements of success. But ultimately, are you moving the needle on the goals of the business? Sure, you had 100% attendance for this kind of training, but are people doing what you set out to do? And a lot of that really has to stem from the objectives that you set when developing the training. Are you using the word understand a lot in your objectives? And if you are, stop doing that, right? How do you measure that? How do you measure understanding? It's very, very difficult. So you have to find other ways to measure success. Are people applying knowledge? Are they explaining things to customers? Are they developing new products for us as a company? Those are measurements. And then you can kind of backfill. Learning and training will never, in my opinion, be directly correlated to success, but you can kind of look at it as potential causation, right? Like we helped to influence the sales team increase their sales this quarter, or we had less attrition in this particular division that usually has a high level of attrition. We saw a lot of managers went to more training last quarter. We can make the case to say the training that we launched to this side of the business helped have an effect on higher sales, less attrition, lower attrition, stuff like that.
Yeah, and again, I think this kind of touches on the important point of learning, and really also like developing a culture of learning is answering that question, like how would you measure the pros and cons of a culture, right? It's very difficult question to answer. And so I think, loosening that idea that there has to be a very direct correlation between effect and outcome is very difficult. And I think a lot of L&D people can kind of take the weight off their shoulders by relieving themselves a little bit from that, because again, that can be often a demand from senior leadership or people who might not completely and fully understand what learning and development does. Nathan, any thoughts or builds on measuring the impact of social learning strategies or tactics, how they should be measured?
Yeah, well, I think that measurement and tying learning to outcomes is kind of always the hard part, right? Everyone's been talking about this in learning and development forever. Can you actually tie to business outcomes? And to the example that Rory was giving earlier, if you do a learning program for a sales team, sales go up. Well, was that the learning and development program, or was that the new tool that we just bought that kind of helps us find more data about our prospects? So that's hard. I think that as a prerequisite, you must look at the leading indicators. For example, the 3 formats that I mentioned earlier with workshops, lunch and learns, groups, and one-on-ones. It's really about the amount of information exchanged. So how many sessions are happening? That's kind of your leading indicator. It's similar to attendance for other things. But with social learning, and again, to Rory's point earlier, is it's something that you want to be happening over time naturally, where you are not necessarily the organizer of every single lunch and learn and workshop and one-on-one, that the culture starts to pick that up. And so to me, the key thing is not just the absolute number of sessions that are happening, but recurrence. Are you consistently seeing that you launched the mentorship program, but then month 12, you are still having as many sessions as you were having in month 6? That to me is the stickiness of the program itself. And, I don't think people that are super busy are going to continue having lunch and learns and one-on-one sessions if they're not useful to them. So to me, I acknowledge all the challenges with measuring in the business outcomes. I think to me, you still have to look at the leading indicators. And the most important thing with those leading indicators is to actually measure the stickiness of that over time, even when you're a little bit more hands-off.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to social learning, I'd also very much caution people when it comes to measuring. Not everything needs to be measured, and you really can't measure everything, especially when it comes to learning. Like mentorship is a really great example. We've had mentorships at almost every organization that I've been at, and sometimes they're really great, and sometimes you have people that go to every meeting, but still like nothing is sticking. You don't know, like they could be just having those conversations and just kind of be gossiping the entire time, and now they've just kind of found a friend. And so it's okay to not measure things, especially when it comes to social learning. You just have to kind of trust people to be adults, to take learning in, and then push it out for the betterment of the organization. Track what you can, where it's important to do that. And if you look at it and say, it's okay, we don't need to track this data. We don't need to show any success other than attendance, because you'll never get the data that shows, well, I had a one-on-one with my manager, or I had meetings with a coach. Well, am I using it as a therapy session, or am I really getting coaching out of it? So just kind of be very, as an L&D professional myself, like just be very wary when it comes to reporting and submitting data to leadership. You don't want to kind of get in the trap of data equals X. This is like not always the case.
Very tough to measure problem. Awesome. So want to be mindful of time. Budgeting about 10 minutes left for the rest of the panel, but again, might go a little bit over, but again, looking for something within 20 minutes. But with that said, would like to go on to the next question. So this is a topic I know both of you are obviously very well versed in, from implementing it to also designing and building it. So I'd like to pose this one, and Nathan, feel free to kick it off. So what role can technology play in facilitating social learning?
Yeah. I think there's 2 main points that I'd want to make on technology helping. One is on scale and amount of work to organize your programs as learning and development specialists or professionals. And then 2 is on helping learning and development professionals understand the needs and topics of learning within their organization. So on the first point, scale, in the past, you were probably the sole coordinators of different social learning opportunities like workshops and training. And you also were the ones generating the content. You had to invite 30 people into a room. And by the way, that was literally physically the limit of how many people that could attend that training. And then you'd have to repeat this many times a year. And now with software, you can scale this thing to much larger audiences. You can easily invite 100 people into attend a session or webinar. Or if you use a mentoring platform like Together, you can have thousands of coordinated one-on-one matches across the world, and give them each a personalized agenda. And so that's kind of the virtual part of it. I think the second point of it is about understanding the topics and needs, and then the content generation itself. I think the world is changing so quickly that you saw in COVID, for example, our customers, the employees at our customers wanted to talk much more about coping with work from home and strategies for time management all of a sudden. And then all of a sudden, in the last year or two, we've seen an incredible leap in AI technology. And people are now suddenly interested in how to implement that in their day-to-day. So you really can't keep up fast enough with the pace of the new demands that people want to learn about. And the collective knowledge of your employees, however, is kind of enough to generate a great workshop by a specific topic expert on this new topic, because somebody's been researching it. So I think for a social learning program, the right thing to do is to crowdsource what content people want to focus on based on demand, rather than come up with it yourself. And technology's role is to help with that. For example, in a mentoring program, if you're running that with technology, you can figure out what are the skills that most people want at the exact time that they were registering, that they want to work on. And oh, by the way, that platform can also ping you 6 months later and say, hey, what are you now focused on? Let's find you a new mentor. So I think that's one of the key things that technology brings.
Amazing. Rory, any builds, thoughts on this question as well?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in L&D, you can kind of talk about tech forever, just because these days, like Nathan said, it's imperative. You need to have a really good tech toolkit so that you can scale. But I always look at technology as it is just a tool, right? It is my bionic arm. Like I can't lift a car, but maybe with a bionic arm, I could. But do I need to lift that car? Right? Technology is great, but for the sake of it, will only be detrimental to any learning social program you have. Because if you don't have the right understanding of how it's going to help the organization grow, how it's going to help people grow, how it's going to reach your goals, then now it's just technology for the sake of technology. And it will completely devalue any sort of learning culture that you have, because now you have a giant tech stack. Nobody knows where to go to get what information. It's missing information for me personally, yet the company has put so much money and communication behind this particular platform. It's something to just always be aware of, that learning and development and social learning has been happening for centuries and for generations without tech. And so it's great that we have it available to us. It's great that it will help us scale within our organization to prove use case. But is it the right thing for us when we need it? Or are we just kind of getting it because we were told we needed to get it?
Yeah, very true. And I think this is kind of an approach, and again, this is a nice segue into the next question as well too. But going from 0 to 100 with a new program that's doesn't even have any validation behind it, in terms of, is there actual like positive feedback from the employees, who at the end of the day, like, that's who we're trying to develop, and that's who's trying to learn. It's got to work for them first before you leverage technology to scale it. So with that said, may have even teased a little bit of either of your answers, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the common mistakes or missteps that you've either done yourself, or you've seen other people do when it comes to implementing social learning within their learning and development programs. So Rory, would love to have you kick this one off.
Yeah, I would say the biggest mistake that I've made, or that, people that I know in the industry is not having adequate leadership buy-in around that culture of learning within the organization. An example of this is the our learning management system at Komodo Edison has a phenomenal feature. Like I said, they're big on this whole thing with like collaborative learning. So every e-learning course, whatever it is that we put into our learning management system, has a forum in it. And when we went and we acquired the system, we're thinking people are going to have conversations, they're going to ask questions, they're going to do all this stuff while they're taking a course in line. So I'm watching a video and I can ask a question to the instructor. It's amazing, right? We completely overestimated people's level of wanting to do that, right? I'm busy. I have a million things that I need to do in my day. I'm taking this course. I'm going to this live training session. This is it. Like, this is all you're getting from me because I got a list of to-do things that is a mile long. And so if you don't have leadership buy-in from the get-go, where your executive team is going to communicate down, or leaders are going to communicate down, this is important. We want you guys to be engaged. This is going to help you grow within the company. It's going to help the company reach its goals. Then you're just kind of throwing stuff out there, hoping it sticks, and it almost never will, right? Like, that buy-in is imperative to any successful learning product, culture, program, training, podcast, whatever it is. Otherwise, people don't have any sort of with them. They don't know why they need to do it. They don't know how it's going to help them.
Yeah. No, I think that's an absolutely important point. Buy-in, not only for the sake of communication, but at the bare minimum, like, you need buy-in to actually end up doing these programs and taking these initiatives as well too. Nathan, any thoughts from you on this question before we move on?
Yeah, definitely. I think my advice would be know your learner. And what I mean by that is, I'll tell you a quick story. So within Together, mentorship platform that matches mentors and mentees, you can customize what are the rules between which mentees get matched with which mentors within an organization. And as we develop that matching algorithm, what we learned is that every customer used it completely differently depending on their organization. So we had one global organization where the seniority levels within the company are very well defined. Everybody walks around knowing I'm a P5, I'm a P4, I'm a G2. And so making sure that the seniority gap was the correct one between mentees and mentors is very important. If you match somebody with a mentor that's the wrong level, they're just not going to find that an interesting mentor. And that's just one example. Every organization has different nuances, but I think if you're the learning and development team, you got to talk to the learner. You got to interview them, talk about what's useful to them, why was that helpful or why was that not helpful, and then adjust over time. And that might be, I would rather have a group recurring session rather than a one-off lunch and learn, then adapt to it that way. But I think making sure that you talk to the learner, and that's kind of what we do when we're trying to design software, is we're always talking to the learner, is critical for making sure that you're a success. Spot on.
There's a lot of parallels between creating programs and really about creating anything, is that it's meant to be used by somebody for a specific outcome. And so if you don't know who you're making it for, you don't know what their needs are, you don't know what the problems that exist that they're trying to solve, it's ultimately going to fall possibly flat, or even worse, it's going to do damage. So yeah. Rory, any additional thoughts before we move on to the last question? Cool, amazing. So we got about 10 minutes left. Going to go on. I see the Q&A. We got one question in, so we'll continue working with this. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll get to them pretty shortly. So I'd like to end this talk on a kind of like an open-ended and kind of like an exciting note as well too. I think, as we've mentioned, there's a lot going on, not only with L&D but with technology. The world's going faster today than it has it feels like ever. So with that in mind, I want to ask a question about what really excites you about the future of social learning. This could be a tool, this could be a program, an idea that you have. Really kind of looking forward here in the future of what can really drive impact for organizations and their L&D teams. So Rory, would love to have you take this one away.
Yeah, what excites me about social learning, one thing is the culture of business. I think, where that's going, where organizations are starting to put their emphasis on human capital, I think is really exciting and will have a huge impact on social learning in the workplace.
Nathan, any follow-ups to that?
Yeah, I have something that I'm really excited about when it comes to social learning and the future of that. And bear with me, but I really think that there's a lot of potential in the generative AI space to help learning and development people. And I'll tell you why. I really think that not using generative AI tools over the next 5 years will be like kind of when the tractor came out and you're still manually farming, and then there's other people using tractors. So what I think generative AI is going to be really useful for is increasing the amount of knowledge exchange between employees. If you go today to somebody and ask them to run a workshop or to book an introductory session with a mentor, there's a huge intimidation factor around the work involved for that and preparing for that. And when you feel unprepared, you say no. And I'll tell you a story. I recently had an upcoming mentorship session, an introductory mentorship session with a very senior product executive to discuss problems I was having. And I almost canceled my meeting about a week before because I just felt like it wasn't going to be useful to him or to myself. However, I sat down, I actually created an agenda. I used some generative AI as well to help me. And I instantly felt like I would not be wasting his time. And I kept the mentoring session. We ended up going 2 times longer than the original meeting was planned for. I learned a ton. And so I think that right now, in seconds, you can have the seed of an idea for a workshop and turn that into a fully fledged agenda. You can have a 60-minute agenda to guide that session. You can also use your AI as a research assistant to help you dig deeper and get smart before facilitating a session. So to me, I really think that you're going to see a huge shift in learning tools start to incorporate generative AI. And we are doing that today. And I just think that it's going to be critical to preparing for learning and development sessions.
Yeah. And I think kind of harkening back to a point that Rory made, and I think that's been pretty common throughout every answer here, is again, the ubiquity and the whether you like it or not, it's happening nature of social learning. I think with the AI tools and generative AI in particular, is that it really does lower those barriers to allow people to then do things that were previously seen as high effort. Like you mentioned, making a workshop. And so really it is like, if you can teach people how to use generative AI, you can give them more responsibility to then go and be learners and really create that culture of learning, when the act of creating content, employee generated content with that organizational context, is now incredibly easy. It doesn't take half of your week and you're not missing 1,000,001 meetings out of your day. A senior sales leader can create the content to educate, new salespeople on their team and whatnot. Okay, we got 5 minutes left. Rory, any additional thoughts on that before we go to Q&A?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about AI forever. I've had conversations about AI. I think I personally don't think the future of L&D is in AI generated content. I think that's the wrong avenue for organizations to go down. I think, and I don't say that because I'm worried AI will take the job as a learning and development creator. Honestly, I want them to. Like, there are a million things that I'd rather be doing than creating content. The problem is when you're asking AI to create content, it doesn't know the culture of your organization. And where AI, in my opinion, where the future of AI is when it comes to learning and development, it's learning in the flow of work. So leave the content generation up to the learning and development department. Let me create 800 lessons, put them into the LMS, and then have my learners ask the LMS, hey, I want to learn how to put this stuff into Salesforce, and let it create the course that is specifically tailored to our organization, our Salesforce instance, and let it spit out a unique training based on whatever criteria that we set, which is, hey, all of our courses have to be 3 minutes. Let it spit out a 3-minute course using the content that we generated to our end learner, so that, again, learning in the flow of work can happen. But that's my opinion. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for social learning. When it comes to AI, I don't necessarily think that is the right solution for human capital and for people. But yeah, another conversation.
Yeah. Could have a whole other hour on that one.
That's right. Yeah.
With that, again, we got one question. Want to make sure that we get an answer to it. So, yeah, guess if you needed time to take a little break of water, feel free to do that. Again, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in. Otherwise, we'll get to them now. So we've got a question here from Chelsea, and the question is, how can you encourage a culture of learning in staff at an organization so that staff are excited to learn and don't feel like it is another workshop or a video they have to view? Rory, I feel like you're probably the best suited one to answer that question. So I'll pose that one away to you.
Yeah, creating a culture of learning isn't easy. Your biggest competitor as somebody in learning development is time, and the time of the employees that you have to train. Again, they have a very tough decision to make. I'm either going to spend 5 minutes training, or I'm going to spend 5 minutes doing real work. But to answer your question, if you haven't already, I highly recommend going out and reading Dan Ariely's book, Payoff. It talks about how people are motivated. And so in order to effectively create a culture of learning within your organization, you really need to know what motivates people so that you can go ahead and provide that level of motivation. Something we do at Komodo that is extremely motivating is we have a learner of the month. Every month, we create a really nice kind of one-pager. We highlight an individual. This person went to the most training last quarter, last month. Like I said, we do it monthly. But it doesn't stop there. What we do is we have 4, maybe 5 canned questions that they must answer. And it's, what was your favorite course? What did you learn from that course? What are you excited to learn next? How are you applying that information at Komodo? And how do you find time to learn? So providing recognition for people who are succeeding, who are going above and beyond, and then sharing their secrets, quote unquote, with the organization, you get much higher engagement, especially if you guys have a work from home and all hands. Getting your leadership team to give recognition to that individual will drive culture of learning through the roof.
I would
Awesome.
quickly add, my approach would just be show, don't tell. We had an instance within Together where inside our own organization where actually the CEO learned something over the weekend and was able to perform a task that one of our engineering teams, it took 3 weeks to do. But they learned some new tools, and the CEO doesn't even get their hands in engineering ever. But as a side project, just to continuously learn, on a weekend, did that, came in, made a presentation, and all of a sudden, wow, the CEO did something that took me 3 weeks to do in a given day. I get the impact of learning. I get the impact of fine-tuning my skill sets. So I think show, don't tell. When the leaders are actually showing what their results are of their learning efforts, I think that's the best way.
Amazing. Thank you. And I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So we are going to end the session now. We are a minute over. Before we head out, just want to point you into some direction of some resources that we do have. One program we have talked about quite often here is mentorship. If you are currently running one, looking to run one or interested in it. We have a lot of best practices, a lot of information on how to actually think about implementing one, starting one, even if you're running one, how to optimize and grow that. I'd also like to point you to an event that we're hosting next week. This is a masterclass on reporting on mentorship's impact, where one of our CSMs who works with organizations like the UN, Discovery, Airbnb, they'll be chatting about a rather holistic way about how we measure the success and performance of mentorship programs. So with that, thank you all for joining us here today. Rory, Nathan, thank you so much. You guys were phenomenal. Fantastic answers. I think the audience got a lot of value about that. And yeah, with that, I'll end the session. Thanks everybody and have a great day.